All right. I also have a couple of ideas that I think have potential to be persuasive speeches. Now, one of them is, I think you ought to look into some of the practices of corporate farming, and you can just go to town on all the horrors that come from that. You can talk about genetically modified crops and how genetically modified food is sold in the United States. It's not labeled. In many other parts of the world, there are serious, serious concerns about whether these things are healthy, what they do when people eat them, and so forth. Sort of a parallel one is what corporate pressures on farming do is they encourage farmers to grow fewer and fewer varieties to where there's just a few varieties, the ones that produce the most output, the ones that yield the biggest crops at the end of the season. And the problem with that, they call that monoculture. The problem is some fairly simple plant diseases can come through and just completely wipe them out. And what's always been a protection against that in generations past was we had a lot of varieties of crop growing. Even, wheat farmers in a particular part of the country, each one might be growing a different variety of wheat. But if there's one variety of wheat that is thought of as the most economical, and almost everybody is using it, and then a blight comes through that takes out that wheat, then nobody has any wheat. And if you do a little bit of reading into the problem of corporate farming, and specifically into the problem of monoculture, what I think you'll find is you can really get some good vivid descriptions of how dangerous this is, and you can really sell it to the judges that you're likely to encounter, that if our food supply is threatened, if you can't go to the supermarket anymore and find the food you want, or if the price simply gets so high that you have to choose between, say, buying food and paying for your prescriptions, or buying food and paying your rent every month, that's something that I think you could easily characterize as a problem. Now, in a persuasive speech, problems and solutions are a dime a dozen. The reason that I think that this topic has particular appeal to it is, with almost every other persuasive speech, you describe the problem, then you describe the solution, you make it sound like it's feasible and within people's grasp, and that's the end of the speech. Well, there's one extra wrinkle on this one. Here's what I think you ought to do as the solution to the problem. You ought to encourage your audience to start growing their own food, and in particular, you should talk in the solution step about heirloom varietals. You can talk about tomatoes, you can talk about garlic, you can talk about, there's several examples of this. There are people whose hobby it is to keep different varieties of different food crops that go back generations within their family, that are specific to a particular region. And what you can do is, you can do what everybody does in persuasive speeches and make the solution sound as though it's within people's reach and fairly easy to do. You can talk about how you can grow tomatoes in a window box. You can grow tomatoes in a planter that sits in your kitchen. But in addition to talking about how, scary problem from the earlier part of my speech, a blight is going to wipe out all the crops and then food prices are going to go through the roof. In addition to talking about how the solution will help your audience avoid that, you can also talk about varieties. Heirloom varietals have flavors that you have never, ever tasted before. And the food experience is just incredible. There are pleasures out there that they never could have imagined. And what I think could set you apart competitively from the other persuasive speeches in the room, everybody else is just going to make the audience, well, most of them at least, are just going to make the audience aware of the scale and the severity and the consequences of the problem, and then they'll make their solution sound nice and reasonable, and that's the persuasive speech, problem solution, or maybe problem cause, problem consequences. At any rate, your speech will stand out because not only will the solution sound as though it wipes out the problem, but the solution in itself is going to sound like something they want to do. So, you're coming at them persuasively from both directions, with a little bit of fear appeal at the beginning of the speech, but also some appeal at the end of the speech, a positive appeal that enjoyment and pleasure that you had not considered are waiting for you, and currently you're squandering them. So that's one that I think you ought to look at. A second one, and this is based on some kind of recent developments in communication research, but it could get your audience to take another look at a practice that they don't really think about that much. And the term here is co-rumination. Co-rumination. And one particular researcher, whose name you might want to Google to find some of the ways into this, some of the published sources, so you can cite them in your speech, Amanda Rose, who is a professor at the University of Missouri at Columbia. Now, what co-rumination is, it's the practice of taking your problems and finding a friend and talking to a friend about your problems. Now, that's an oversimplification. There are certain patterns that qualify those conversations as co-rumination. If you're just describing the problem, if you're just speculating about the problem, there are things that set it apart from actual productive discussion that considers solutions and looks for perception checking and so forth. So you're going to need to read into this, and you're going to need to be able to explain the difference. But the way you can characterize it and sell it to the judges that you're going to encounter is, we think of this as something positive. We think of, if you got a problem, talk it out with your good friend. What we don't understand is it can actually be very destructive. It can actually snowball. It can lead people to feelings of greater and greater depression. And you think, well, I'll just talk to someone and then I'll feel better. But what research shows is when you talk to someone about your problems and you kind of frame them in the wrong fashion, you approach the conversation in the wrong fashion, you can make it a lot worse. So, in the problem part, at the beginning of your persuasive speech, you identify what co-rumination is, you help equip the audience to recognize it when it's happening, and then you talk about depression, talk about how it generally just kind of makes things worse. And there's where you want to point out that in the research it comes up that women, young women in particular, teenage girls, are far more likely to do this than males, and pretty much more likely to do it than people at other stages of life. And then in the solution step, you talk about ways of approaching problems, ways of talking with your friends about problems that are more constructive. And I think that this is something that they're likely enough to be unfamiliar with that you can really challenge and change their thinking about the practice of going to people with their problems. So I think that that's a speech topic that could have a lot of appeal. So that's kind of my preliminary list of topics that I'm going to run by my team members, and we're going to see what the potential is for any of those. And obviously they'll come back from summer with their own ideas. But if any of those appeal to you, you are welcome to them, and good luck to you as you are getting your act together for another season.